Okay, so I'm going to both agree with almost everything Steph said, but nonetheless make an argument for holding on to the idea of science capital as different in some way, and also thinking about science capital as under threat at the moment, and that matters. And I'm not going to talk about the way in which it's under threat from people outside of science, which has already been touched on today, but the way it's a threat from some forces within science. I should say that I'm coming from the perspective of somebody trained in science and technology studies and originally in the life sciences, and I'm drawing particularly on work in my more recent book, Good Science, that came out at the end of last year, and a new project I've just begun comparing US and UK science elites. I'm going to make the case that science is a different form of capital and that it has particular points of more and less fungibility with cultural capital writ large. And then move on to ask whether we're at a moment where that's being lost and at what cost. And I will end by offering a socially transformative suggestion or two, but I'll try to do it all quickly. So science itself is a bundle of contradictions. It's both vocational and it's that thing that works and is useful. It's linked in its history to the rise of capitalism. And it's linked in particular with democracy and the idea that some of its norms, even in the breach, are the same as the norms of democracy. And yet it's seen as something that really separates the sheep from the goats. But I want to focus on these aspects of science capital that are, I think, rather distinct. So the first is the scientific persona, the presentation of self, and this idea that it still remains a field where you really are, to a large extent, driven by the content of what you do. That there's something really important about the passion and the interest in the thing you're doing itself. That in a way you ask questions of the world as a way of turning away from worldliness. There's also the place of science as truth or in truth that Steph mentioned in her paper that she circulated beforehand, that remains important to what it is to do science and to science capital, I believe. And the sense in which that's orthogonal to social capital, that yes, science is full of all kinds of conventions, but in some ways there's this empirical basis that underlies it that can set you straight. And whether or not, the extent to which that's true has been massively debated, but that at least that idea, the hold that that has on us, and the importance of that in the notion of science capital. Also the place of science in economic activity. So this is more of a kind of why people care about science. So the idea that it is the basis of innovation in this day and age, particularly through the idea that innovation trickles down to everybody and brings about economic growth. And in my own research, I found that there are a lot of circulating ideas about somehow having run out of new things to give value to, and the areas of science and the areas of finance as being two recent areas where we've been ontologically creative. We've added new things that can be valued, and so they are this compulsion for growth that underlies capitalism is renewed continually within science. There's also the really powerful role that science still plays in narratives of routes out of social disadvantage. It's still seen by many people, and I can, if anybody has any questions about this, I can talk more about, breaking this down more by gender and ethnicity and class in particular, but it's still seen as a place where, at least for some people, some of the time, the circumstances of your birth needn't shackle you. You needn't entirely reproduce your social class. And not only that it's somewhere, that it's a way to progress, to be upwardly mobile, to be participate in the meritocratic society, but also that it might be a way to do so without having to give up ways in which you are discriminated against, or ways in which you cannot or are not allowed to have certain kinds of cultural capital. So it's a way to get access to meritocracy, for example, even if you don't wish to or are not able to give up your religion, change your mother tongue language, change the conditions in which you live or are born. There's also a really strong set of narratives around science as something where you can reach up into the social elites, even if you're, as many people have said, to put it to me, on the spectrum. So even, which is referring to the sort of normative end of the Asperger's, that if you're in the technical fields, you're not necessarily very good socially, that nonetheless you can excel and you can make your way up into the elites, and indeed you can head up a big learned society and still not know what to say at cocktail parties. That somehow that idea that it's a way to progress in society and even progress with all kinds of social recognition without ever requiring those things that are equated with social class or smooth, or that somehow it's forgiving of one's terrible personality. And then finally, in terms of thinking about it as its own kind of capital, the place of science in governance, just how important scientific knowledge is to the way in which different governments run themselves. And there's a lot to be said about all the different regions of the world in this regard: access to aid, shares of innovation, patent control, and things like that. But I'm just going to focus right now on a distinction that's made between the UK and US. People typically say about the US that science is mobilized in governance as a form of expertise, and people typically say in the UK that it's mobilized as a form of honor, almost. And you can see as you walk into this door, everyone who's headed this august institution has all kinds of alphabetic soup after their names. So there is some sort of elision as you move up science with these kind of systems of honor in the UK. My own research, again, suggests that those are much more messy. Those two ideal types of what it's like in the US and the UK are nothing like as distinct as that. But okay, so in there were some things that were very important economically, some things that were very important ideologically, some things that were very important to sort of hopeful narratives of the self. I think there are reasons to hang on to the idea of science capital as being distinct. It's also under risk at the moment, though. There's a takeover in much of the life sciences of this demand for translational work, that the work that you do ought to be picked up by industry, so that the idea that you do the pure research or the basic research for its own sake needs this kind of economic justification. And we see a creep. So, for example, in the US, it's increasingly common to evaluate people at major promotion points in their careers, not only based on how they do with their academic work, but also based on their translational activity. There's also a move in the US, maybe more than in the UK, to no longer police that boundary between monetary capital and science capital. So this idea, the embracing of the idea that, yes, you have your Porsche when you're very, very successful as a scientist, and that it's okay to out yourself as somebody who's rich if you're successful in science. The risk, which may be perfectly okay in some ways, but it's arguable that that plays into this idea that once you enter the science elites, you become less and less in touch with the actual science that's being done and more part of, let's say in the US, a government or a financial or a leisure time elite, and in the UK, more part of an honorary elite, constantly doing things for learned societies and the government and Brussels, and having less time in your lab. And again, it's arguable that that ties into crises we're seeing at the moment with reproducibility and things like that, where you genuinely have circumstances, or it's increasingly common for lab leaders not to know the scientific veracity of papers that they're authors on, and so we have the rising rate in failures of reproducibility, retraction of prominent scientific papers, and so on. We also know that, discrimination in the STEM fields continues to be extremely strong. The studies this past year in the US of sending blind letters made up from a male or a female, or from people with different ethnic-sounding names, ethno-racial-sounding names, and seeing the different uptake of professors in terms of willingness to hire, amounts they're willing to compensate, readiness to get back to a made-up new graduate student coming into your department, and seeing that the more elite the institution, the less likely people are to be racially and gender diverse in their equity of answer, and the more they're willing to pay white men over all other groups, and more willingness to answer quickly and to hire them. So hanging on to, and indeed elaborating all the ways in which science capital might keep that Enlightenment promise is extremely important, I would say. And I'd just add from doing the field work for my book, Good Science, as the science elites become more fungible in the US with other parties to things like innovation, patent lawyers, university administrators, biotech and venture capitalists, and so on, there's a kind of form of epistemic bullying. There's a kind of form of aggressiveness around knowledge that can be very exclusive and experienced as extremely intimidating and unpleasant by many people. And as that creeps down the ranks, that then becomes its own force in moving people out. Okay, so I think there are reasons to hold on to the notion and reasons to keep saying that science capital is distinct and matters. From my years of work in trying to get people into the STEM field, I have two suggestions for transformation. The first, and I work on leaky pipelines all the time, let's just drop the pipeline. It doesn't have to be a pipeline. Science doesn't have to be a pipeline, and I think several people are making exactly that point, that it doesn't have to be a pipeline. At the moment, I cannot understand why we don't have multiple routes into science, except that we so base it on maths. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be like law, or like medicine is in the US, or is at times of war, or so on. We've seen in many situations where there's been social crises and we've had to move more people into maths, that if people are taught it at different points in their lives, they can do it. So in fact, we're holding on to something that's silly, but we're so invested in that idea of it being hard. Yes, keep working and working in schools, and we had a wonderful panel on schools this morning, but let's not have the other routes into science be remedial. Let's have them be really high status in the same way that other professional schools are post-baccalaureate and are really high status. I always think about the car in this regard. That's a piece of heavy machinery that we operate at high speeds in incredibly close proximity to one another. And we did this extraordinary thing. We thought that everyone could do it. And around the world, we believe that anyone can do it. And it's really hard, and it's really technical, and yet everybody's crashing around really fast next to each other. And you know what? It's kind of okay. Most people can do it, and even people who need the car adapted can do it really well. So there isn't any particular reason why we need to have it be whether or not you succeed in maths at some age. And especially important in that is that some groups of children cannot keep their social status if they do maths and technology. Some can, and it varies by gender and race, but some cannot. So if you're from a group of students who cannot keep your social status by doing maths and science, unless you're already socially ostracized, you won't go into maths and science. So you need to have other routes in. Some groups benefit well from school maths, and some groups need to do it later. And finally, the last thing I'm going to say is that the best way to get people in is to invite them. Pick a random person, put your finger on the census and say, hey, come and have a job at, I don't know, BP. We will train you. We believe that you can go to the DMV and pass your driving license at BP. Come. And it's amazing how many people will come if you invite them. Thank you.